Todd is a PhD of African history by the University of Minnesota, and is actually currently a professor at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, Arkansas. His research interests are rather broad, and they focus on Portuguese history, diamond mining, and labor history in the Portuguese third imperial third empire, football or soccer, and tourism. He has lived long periods of time in Portugal, but also in Angola and also in Mozambique. So these are the main research fields, and probably a little bit also in Guinea-Bissau, if I might add. Yes, a little bit. So the first question, let's kick off with the first question is, so you have researched extensively and published extensively in Portuguese history with several articles, several books. How did your interest in for Portuguese history came about? You know, colonial Portuguese history.
Sure. So the sort of simple answer to that question is I've always been interested in history. And so as an undergraduate, I was a history major, interested particularly in European history. And at the master's level, I started working with a professor named Dr. Douglas Wheeler, who sadly recently passed away, on Spanish history and Portuguese history, so Iberian history in general. But of course, he was much more interested and focused upon Portuguese history. And so I sort of slowly gravitated towards Portuguese history, although I confess I knew very little about it previously, other than the sort of generic stuff we learn as high school students in America about the Portuguese explorers, etc. And so around that same time, while I was working on my master's with Doug Wheeler, my sister happened to be in the Peace Corps, and she was living in, or she was serving in, however you want to characterize that, in Guinea-Bissau. And so I was fortunate enough to go to West Africa. I actually traveled overseas from Senegal down to Guinea-Bissau, and really kind of just fell in love with Africa, got the bug, as they say. And so spent significant time in, not significant, sorry, about a few weeks in Guinea-Bissau with her. And this was right as my master's was concluding, and I was interested in applying for PhD programs. And so I became increasingly, rather than sort of from the Portuguese colonial perspective, I became increasingly interested in how Africans experienced colonialism, how they navigated the colonial project, in particular the Portuguese colonial project. And so when it came time to apply to PhD programs, I kind of pivoted or shifted, if you will, and instead of applying to programs in which I'd be studying European history or European colonial history, I decided to study African history. And that sort of set me off down this path. My initial, or my dissertation project, ended up being on Diamond, as you know, and it's something that took me a while to come to. I was kind of sort of fishing around for a project. I knew I wanted to work on Lusophone Africa. I was, I can't exactly pinpoint why, but I was most interested in Angola. But problematically, I started my PhD program in 2000, and the civil war was still raging in Angola at that time. But thankfully, by 2002, the war had concluded, and it became sort of, although it remained an extremely challenging context in which to conduct research, it became more reasonable to target Angola as a prospective research location. So I first traveled to Angola in, summer of 2003, I believe, and did sort of some very preliminary field work in and around Luanda. Essentially just worked in the National Archive. And then it wasn't till my wife and I moved to Angola in summer of 2004, and ended up staying for a couple years. And so over the course of that period, it took a lot of time, and George, you can attest to this, to gain access to Lunda, the diamondiferous, it's the word in English, I'm not sure how that translates, the diamond-bearing region of Angola where Diamond used to have its operations. And so I'd go out there under the aegis of a number of different sort of entities. You and I were fortunate to travel out sort of with the sanctioning of the Ministry of Health to Dundu, which was Diamong's administrative headquarters, and interview a number of people, primarily related who had worked in the health services during the colonial period. After that, I was able to link up with some individuals who actually once, actually, I forgot about this. We went out with the assistance of the church and stayed at the some sort of protocol. Yeah.
At the Spiritanos.
Yes, I'd forgotten about that. At other times, I would go out with companies who were actively mining in Lunda, specifically in Western Lunda, where it was much less tranquil, put it that way. So there's a great deal of violence, daily gunfire, this sort of thing, because there were mining companies that were sanctioned by the government, who were contractually permitted to mine in that area. But there were also garimpeiros, so informal miners, and then very highly organized illicit mining operations. And so they were sort of all vying for the same stones buried in the same earth, but they do that sort of at different times of the day. So the formal mining companies would mine during the day. The garimpeiros were always sort of on the perimeter trying to gain access, and then the illicit mining companies would move in quickly at night, set up operations, and then sort of leave by the morning. But as you might imagine, it was a highly contested area. So it's very, very difficult to conduct field work in that area. That project took me a fair amount of time, of course, but was ultimately able to turn that dissertation into a book in 2014, 2015, somewhere around that time. And then I became interested in diamond mining more broadly in Africa. It's not that the research, of course, inherently is hyper-focused on a particular space and a particular time. But of course, I had to read widely to situate my work in the historiography and the scholarship and the relevant scholarship. But I became increasingly interested in diamond mining in West Africa and so on and so forth. And was able to publish a book more broadly about diamond mining. That was my second book about diamond mining across the continent, in a series that I now co-edit with Ohio University Press that aims to generate texts that are more accessible, aimed at undergraduate audiences, perhaps.
Which you might name that press, which is?
Yep, Ohio University Press.
Okay.
Very prominent in African studies.
Yeah.
From there, I was, so my Diamong book is essentially about labor. So it's about the African laborers on the mines over the period of Diamong's existence, so 1917 until 1975. So my next project, I wanted to sort of continue.
Can I just ask, so you've done diamond, and then you did a second one, which was again more broadly on diamond mining. If I do recall, it was past, and then you end up in the Kimberley process, right? So it sort of brings you up to the present. So my question is, how do you see the impacts of colonialism and the diamond mining? Do they linger on to the contemporary explorations that that we see in terms labor wise, but also in terms of an industry per se?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's strong parallels between contemporary diamond mining in Africa, because you have formal mining operations, and then you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people actively involved in diamond mining, but outside the sort of formal sphere. And so you have what are now called artisanal miners instead of garimpeiros. It kind of has a more of a negative connotation. So there are artisanal miners who are fully legally mining, and have some protections now in place due to some different international treaties, but who are very much living. This is sustenance mining, essentially, if you can think of it that way. They're living sort of day to day, trying to find stones. They're very vulnerable. If they do find meaningful stones, expensive stones, they have to get those to market as quickly as possible, because they don't have the security built in that some of the larger illicit mining operations do, or obviously the formal diamond mining operations. So it's very contested. It's very violent still. But you saw some of that during the colonial period, particularly in West Africa, not so much in Diamong, or not so much in Angola. Diamong operated a very sort of controlled space. And of course, there was illicit mining activity, especially on the fringes of Diamong's area. But in West Africa, for example, in Sierra Leone, they had problems with illicit diamond buying and selling going all the way back into the colonial period. And of course, this sort of activity is much more rife, much more conducive in areas that have alluvial stones, meaning stones that are very accessible with only very rudimentary equipment. Conversely, if you go to South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, these are stones that are buried hundreds, if not thousands of feet underground. And the only way to access those is with intensive capital mining. I mean, you need millions of dollars worth of equipment to even access the stones. So inherently, those mining areas are considerably safer, considerably more tranquil. You don't have the violence associated with alluvial mining that you do even in contemporary Angola, still in West Africa, and a couple other places around the continent. So the depth of one's stones determines greatly the nature of the relationship between labor, between illegal mining and formal or condoned mining, commercial mining. So simply the depth of the stones matters a great deal in terms of the human experience of diamond mining.
Cool. That's a rather interesting point, how the relationship between the depth of the stones and the security and the impact of your life or your biography. And then after that, you sort of moved a little bit. You sort of changed topic, didn't you? What did you do? That I think you, if I do recall, you sort of stumble. You do something unusual for on two terms. On one hand, as an academic, because you started to do sports history, like Portuguese football, soccer, and so that's kind of on one hand it is not as valuable topic as labor is. Labor history is just like, it's probably the creme de la creme, and even more so for a North American, which is, your football is not the football. We do tend to diverge on some views on that. So that's kind of I just wanted to say, why on earth did you go on football, and you started to work on a particular type of football players?
Sure, it's a great question. It is unusual. It's sort of an unusual sort of pathway or journey that I've taken. I should say I'm a huge sports fan, as we would say in America, and so I was trying to identify a way to combine my sort of deep interest in sports, but also in African history and in particular Lusophone history. I don't remember exactly where or when, but I stumbled upon this instance in which the black, I think it might have been a black Mozambican, was competing for the Portuguese Olympic team during the colonial period. And I assumed or presumed that this individual would have been deeply conflicted, especially in the 1960s and 70s, as the wars for independence are raging on, and in Guinea and Mozambique and Angola. And this individual is dressed in, the Portuguese national colors, competing on behalf of Portugal in these different international venues. I kind of transitioned from there quickly to of course, the scores of football players from the colonies who were competing on behalf of Portuguese clubs, Benfica, Porto, Sporting, Belenenses, but also the Portuguese national team during a time when there are, as I mentioned, these multiple conflicts going on in the colonies. And so I found that fascinating, and again, sort of set out assuming that these individuals would have been highly conflicted. The sort of thread that ties the projects together again is labor. So instead of, it is sports history, this book on these Portuguese football migrants, but it's also labor history. I wanted to treat these athletes as laborers and understand what labor strategies they were using to navigate these different contexts. And so I thought about my miners. What did they know? My diamond miners from the first book. What did they know before they set out for the mines? What were they trying to accomplish? What strategies did they employ to navigate, to cope in these foreign and these alien environments? And so I layered that on top of these football players and treated them, instead of superstar athletes, as laborers. What information were they gathering in the colonies about Portugal, the metropole, before moving there? Soliciting advice from players who had gone before them to understand what to ask for contractually. the ways that they prepared themselves, oftentimes not deliberately, but sort of inherently, because they lived in these Portuguese colonial environments, invariably almost in metropolitan or urban areas. They had almost invariably, they had Portuguese coaches as they got to the higher levels of colonial soccer. And so they were learning Portuguese language, learning Portuguese culture, which helped them adapt upon arriving in the metropole. But of course, they also had to navigate a very different space once there. And so they oftentimes, the bonds between, for example, a white Mozambican and a black Mozambican who were in Lisbon together playing soccer or playing football were much stronger than they would have been in the colonies. So as they relocated, they sort of crossed these racial divides and formed these much stronger bonds than they would have had in the colonies. And so I kind of frame all this as a labor history. That just so happens to involve these football players, and so that worked pretty well. It was well received. It was sort of a different way to understand sporting history, the labor migration history, and so I was able to interview a number of players who unfortunately have since passed away. Eusebio being the most famous, but Mario Coluna as well. There's so many others, and they were all very. Again, I can save this for research stories, but in terms of my sort of intellectual curiosity, it was a marriage between my interest in sports and my interest in Lusophone African history, and again the ways that the linkage sort of between the initial diamond work and the more recent sports work was labor, was understanding this through the lens of labor history.
So what can you say the most unexpected finding that came out of it, of all those interviews and of all those because we've interviewed a couple of hundred of them, and or dozens of them, and yeah. you followed you did follow hundreds of them coming, not only for the main clubs that you've mentioned, but also for clubs that are sort of that faded away.
Mm-hmm. I think that's good. I hadn't thought about this one, but I think what was most interesting is kind of what I alluded to before, is how race was backgrounded. It became much less significant in the human experience of migration. So a black player from Mozambique, which would have much more affinity and much more camaraderie with a white player than Mozambique than a black player would with another black player from Angola, for example. So your provenance became so much more important and transcended the racial divides. And I will say this also from a Portuguese colonial perspective. White players from the colonies were treated exactly the same as black players. So white players also had to apply to transfer. It had to be from the colonies to the metropole. It had to be approved. They went through the same process. It was not always easy. Portuguese are, as you well know, extremely bureaucratic. And so, I mean, the paper trail for a white player from Mozambique trying to get to Lisbon was just as long as it was for a black Mozambican player trying to get to Lisbon. They were treated equally. And so if when you think about the sort of Portuguese colonial context, I mean, the predominant differentiator is always race, that shapes the human experience. And I found that in this bizarre sort of soccer arena or labor migration arena, whites and blacks were treated similarly, and not particularly favorably either. It was very difficult for whites to relocate to the metropole for a number of reasons. Oftentimes, as you well know, that whites who traveled to the colonies were oftentimes viewed with some sort of suspicion. They were either people that the metropole was sort of happy to be rid of. Perhaps they were sort of political exiles. So there were reasons perhaps why Portugal proper wasn't overly interested in drawing colonists back into the metropole. But nonetheless, the Portuguese government, the various ministries involved in the transfer process, and oddly, the Ministry of Education was in charge of all football transfers from the colonies back to the metropole. But also the way that race became less significant amongst the players as they interacted upon relocating to the metropole.
Would you say, or again, sort of putting yourself back and seeing this broader picture symbolically, was there a clear winner? Meaning the new state, was it the metropole winning tug of war versus the liberation movement. Was there a clear win? And I mean symbolically in terms.
Sure, of course. That's a great question. I think that the way that what I argue in the book is that it was mutually beneficial for both parties. The football migrants benefited, obviously. They had access to education, for example, at Coimbra or some of the other places. They had access to employment that they wouldn't have had otherwise. They certainly earned more money than they would in a colonial context. And so this is why I sort of push back on this victimization narrative that's been posited by scholars, Paul Darby being whose work I respect, but I diverge in terms of our conclusions regarding the treatment of African football migrants. And certainly there are benefits for the Estado Novo. I mean, they got to showcase especially Black players playing for Portugal as they were trying to fight this public relations battle globally to convey to anyone who cared that they were operating in a multiracial context, and that African players or Africans in general, as symbolized by these players, could rise to the highest levels of Portuguese society. And so it worked obviously extremely well for the Estado Novo from a propaganda perspective. But it also benefited these players as well. They were able to ascend socially, take care of their families. And I think what was important, or what I contend in the book, is if you listen to them speak, you quickly move away from this sort of narrative of victimization. They were able to congregate reasonably freely, express their political views among one another. These were not suppressed, oppressed, exploited. I mean, they were exploited to a certain extent from a propaganda perspective, but they lived very comfortable lives and had a certain amount of freedom to engage in secondary migration. For example, coming into Lisbon, but then deciding that you want to study at Coimbra and requesting a transfer, which was always granted. And so there were educational opportunities. There were all sorts of opportunities available in the metropole that were not available in the colonies for them. So I think it was, to make a long story short, I think it was mutually beneficial for both parties, symbolically for the state, but also materialistically or tangibly for the players.
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting view. Right. So I've, if I can recall, you were a keynote speaker in Geneva. Was it for UEFA or for FIFA?
FIFA.
How did they take this story? You know, was it their first? Because it's rather unusual for the football association to sort of delve into this sort of a history, a labor history that has a little bit of politics in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's been a project, again, that I indicated it's been well received. I think it's there are very few monographs on African football in general, and so it was so eye-opening, and I've been so impressed by the amount of scholarship that's continually generated in Europe regarding soccer or regarding football, football history, football studies, whatever. But I still think that if you work on African football, you tend to be a novelty and more of interest because, for every 25 studies about football in Europe, there's one about Africa. And so suddenly, even if your work isn't all that amazing, I'd like to think my work is good. All of a sudden, your work is of inherent interest to everybody else, because it's not just another work on the history of football in Norway from 1945 to 1960. And like I said, I've been impressed by the depth and breadth of scholarship about football in Europe. But if you're working on some of the other global areas outside of Europe, you suddenly find that you have much less company, and you're not sort of banging into somebody else as you're trying to conduct your research. Sort of the field is yours, if you will. And so I think mine was the first monograph. I mean, there's some hagiographies, if you will. I mean, there's plenty of books in Portugal about Eusebio and Coluna and some of these players. They're essentially biographies that are laudatory, praising their on the field there's almost no mention of on the field action in the book. This is all about, it's a social history. This is all about what they're doing away from the pitch, away from the field, in their free time, talking politics, going to the beach, going to movies, dancing, all these sorts of things. I mean, how they adjusted to life in Portugal. So it's a social history. It's a history of migration. It's sports history because of the topic, but it's not a sort of conventional sports history. And I think that's been well received too. So I think that it sort of sets the book apart in a way. Again, that doesn't make it inherently good, but it does make it different.
If I do recall, you were in Portugal when Portugal won the Euro League. So how did you feel? How did you feel about it? What was it? How did you get any grain of Portugueseness into you? Were you rooting for Anglo-Saxon teams, or are you rooting for your research object?
Okay, so this, I can answer this in a couple of different ways, but I think the most compelling would be that I felt very Portuguese, and I'll tell you why. Because I also lived through Euro 2004, and that was a heartbreaking experience. And so that's always lingering sort of in the back of your mind, is 2004, when the Portuguese, of course, should have won that tournament, except for the darn Greeks. And so to be that close in 2016, I mean, there was this momentum, but it was a very sort of cautious optimism as they kept advancing, not very convincingly, if you remember, especially in the group stage. I mean, they just barely did what they needed to do to advance, and none of their victories were overly convincing. And then in the final, of course, it certainly looked like they were going to lose, especially after Ronaldo went out injured. And so instead of that being the next 2004, it ended up being something, that almost no one could imagine. I mean, beating the French on home soil without Cristiano. I mean, so it was so exciting. And of course,
the goal from Eder.
That's what I was just going to say. I mean, someone who has, who's descendant from the colonies, ends up scoring the winning goal that generates the first national trophy for Portugal of any sort of meaningful trophy. I know they had success at the under-21 level, but I mean, it was just remarkable. It was a really, really wonderful moment for Portugal. I mean, obviously the club teams have won things in the distant past at this point, but it's been some time.
And then you've moved on. You moved on to again a rather unorthodox and again probably an empty field of studies, which is tourism in Africa. So again, why you moved? So you moved from Angola to a broader view of the empire, and then you moved to the Contra Costa. You moved to Mozambique, and so what was what did it stand out to do a history of tourism in Africa, and namely on that region?
Sure, good question. So again, the thread that links all these otherwise disparate projects is labor, and so I set out to write a labor history of tourism in colonial Mozambique. As you know, or maybe you don't, I don't know. You know a lot more than I think you do, but teasing. I mean, colonial Mozambique, especially from the 1950s and 1960s, was the place to go in Southern Africa. And so they were drawing over 500,000 tourists a year, many from Rhodesia and South Africa, who were trying to escape their version of Africa in a way, and travel to Europe next door. And so they constantly wanted to travel to Mozambique to transport themselves in a way to a Europe that they didn't even really know. So they're fascinated by the prawns, vinho verde, sidewalk cafes. I mean, you can't imagine the things that South Africans talk to me about, the tourists themselves, about why Mozambique was appealing. It was so much more, less rigid racially as well. So they could go out to bars and intermix with black Mozambicans and mestiços, and so there was a freedom that the minute they crossed the border, they felt this freedom. And so what I really wanted to write was a sort of holistic piece about the tourist experience, but also marry that with tourism workers. So Black Mozambican workers in the industry. What opportunities did they have? Why did they gravitate towards the tourism industry? What were the conditions within the tourism industry that were more appealing than, for example, mining in South Africa? So millions of Mozambicans worked in the mines in South Africa, and yet thousands of them stayed behind to work in the tourist industry. And so I was fascinated with the sort of labor conditions. Again, this is sort of a labor history all over again. This is understanding what strategies they employed to navigate this sort of difficult environment, in which, yes, they weren't hundreds of meters under the earth mining, but they had to be extremely subservient to white management, to white guests, etc. So it was not an easy job by any stretch. They were relatively low paying, but the working conditions were much more favorable, much more agreeable than, say, mining. And so with the sports sort of history, I grew more interested in the history of leisure, sports and leisure. And so between my sort of persistent interest in labor, my fascination with Mozambique being a tourist destination, and my interest in my sort of newfound interest in leisure, that all came together into this book, which will be out in a couple months now with Cornell University Press. And again, when I submitted, actually, they contacted me and they had heard that I was doing this work. And again, part of the appeal is its novelty. I mean, the editor for the series said, first of all, you're working on tourism in Africa, the history of tourism in Africa, which almost nobody is. And second of all, you're working on the history of labor in tourism in colonial Africa. He said, this was extremely appealing, just topically, for us as a press. And so that worked out really well. And obviously these things take time, but we're almost at the end of that process here. And then I wrote a sort of a similar book that I did with the Diamond Book, where I looked at the history of tourism and colonial, the entire history of tourism in Africa much more broadly, encompassing the entire continent, all the way from the very first visitors to Africa up to the present day. Essentially, what have governments done to facilitate and enhance and expand tourism following independence? Because they had some very difficult choices to make at independence. Do you return lands that from which Africans had been forcibly relocated in order to create game parks and game reserves? I mean, what do you do with those spaces? So there were very, very difficult decisions that newly independent African governments had to make. So I was interested in that as well. So that's been my interest in tourism, and we're all caught up. I not exactly sure what my next project will be, but it probably will. I'll probably stick with tourism for the time being. I'm really enjoying that as a topic. I'm really interested in that, the sort of touristic dynamic which is a little more anthropological than what I'm accustomed to, between the tourist and the tourist industry, tourist workers.
Okay, yeah, that sounds fascinating. So, prior to moving on, I'll probably ask you on looking back. So you've done and considering that you're staying in this touristic topic or tourism topic. My question here is, so you've done three very strong field works, I assume, in terms of in Angola, where we were together, but also in Mozambique, and also back and forth in between Portugal and also the Mozambican territories, and understanding the labor migration. My question here is, methodologically, did you have any challenges? Are you using the same tools? Is it easy? What's the easiest thing? Because diamond mining is, it's diamonds.
Yeah.
Tourism is lovely, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, again, they're three very different projects, but methodologically they're very similar. They share a lot of the same approaches. In a way, I'm becoming a little bit formulaic. So I started all of these projects in Lisbon, going through the various archival sources. So Biblioteca Nacional, Torre do Tumbo, Arquivo Nacional do Ultramarino, Sociedade de Geografia de Lisboa. I mean, those are, everybody at those places knows me. I've spent enough time at each one of those places, and just working in the diplomatic archive this past time for tourism was also interesting. Ministry of Education for the soccer book. So really canvas Lisbon as thoroughly as possible and all the different archival sources and start there, so that when the next step has always been in these projects to start interviewing individuals who operated in these different environments, so that I have an informed understanding of these milieus, of these environments. Now I'm still incredibly ignorant by the time I sit down and talk to these folks, because I have the sort of colonial perspective. I'm limited in my knowledge based on what's in the archives, although you can certainly read between the lines and read against the grain and try to understand the dynamics. And I've done enough work on Lusophone Africa. I understand the racial dynamics, the human dynamics, etc. So I'm not asking completely uninformed questions, but I don't have this sort of local perspective from these various laborers, whether we think of them as football players or tourism workers or diamond miners. And so that's always been the next step. Now, gaining access to individuals to interview them that's where, although for each project I've done the same thing, the experience has been dramatically different. So it's relatively easy to, for example, to go to Maputo, walk into some of the old hotels, the Polana, for example, go to the front desk and ask if you have anybody who used to work here during the colonial period. And then ask if you can meet them and interview them. It's quite simple. Gaining access to the diamond mines in Lunda was an entirely different proposition, as you well know. But methodologically, the projects have been very similar in that respect, sequentially, linearly, what I do first, what I do next, and what I do last. And I usually end up circling back to Lisbon, trying to determine if I missed anything anywhere, or I need to go back to a particular archive and really sort of dig deeper. So that's been sort of the process for each one of these projects.
Many thanks for this talk, and let's hope we can see each other in the future, either on that side of the pond or on this side of the pond. Okay.
For sure. Yep. Thank you. Obrigado.
And then